Hey designers, welcome back to the studio. So far in our drawing exercises, we've been doing just about everything with contour line. Now contour line means we're not doing any lighting. There's no value, there's no shading. All of the illusion, in other words, is sort of captured by the edge. Just about everything we've done has been captured just with singular lines. The only maybe shading that we've used so far, maybe to differentiate an inside-outside surface or something like that. But eventually, our hope would be able to use lighting to describe forms that appear more realistic, right? That we could actually approach realistic representations of objects. And for that, we need to break that edge, get away from just the hard line, and start to kind of work with value, or what we'll talk about lighting in a space. To do that, what we're going to do is actually go through a couple of exercises that will lay out sort of dark to light gradations using a variety of techniques. Everything from working with our pen and ink to graphite to charcoal to ink, to even doing cuttings and clippings from magazines, just in order to see that light to dark value. To do all this work, we're going to lay out a grid in our sketchbooks and start to fill them in. The grid that we're going to use we'll actually make ourselves. So let's start by grabbing out of the folder that you were given a piece of that tag board. The tag board has a sound that's a little bit like kind of a 3x5 note card or so. It's a little bit thicker. If you still have some pieces of this left over, go ahead, you can cut it out of that. If you don't, something like an old cereal box will work just fine, any kind of food packaging. The cardboard that this stuff is made out of is actually a little bit thicker and even works better. I'm going to make mine out of the cardboard just because I happen to have this scrap laying around. Grab out a couple of tools. You're going to need your X-Acto knife right off the bat, so let's grab that. But since we're going to be doing some pen and ink drawings, go ahead and grab the two pens that you've got. I'm also going to grab my number 6H pencil to do some of the cutting work. You're also going to need your cutting board and the straight edge. Now, no matter which piece of material you're working with, either the cereal box or the other one, you need to break this material down a little bit. The piece that we'll need in the end is about 2 inches by 8 inch strip, so however you're kind of orienting your material, go ahead and break that down. When it comes down to actually making your final measurements, just use the grid that's on your cutting mat here to sort of figure out where your 2 by 8 inch measurements are. What you've got should look a little bit like a bookmark at this point, 2 inches wide by 8 inches tall. Then we'll switch over to the pencil. Now if you can line up your bookmark against your grid so that it's along a vertical and a horizontal, some of these markings will be really easy. We're going to come in a 1/2 inch from the right side, and your grid is set up on a 1/2 inch grid, so just come over one block. I'm using a nice dark pencil so you can see my lines, and a 1/2 inch from the left. We'll then do a 1/2 inch from the bottom and a 1/2 inch from the top. What we're going to do is mark off a 1 inch window with a 1/2 inch border, a 1 inch window with a 1/2 inch border. Easiest way to do that is just to keep this thing lined up on the grid, and then keep track using your 1/2 inch markers. One inch window, 1/2 inch frame. 1 inch window, 1/2 inch frame. You see that I'm actually marking off my windows. I find that this is a little bit easier for me because as we will be cutting these out shortly, it's a bit of a bummer to go through all of this work measuring and marking off your grid only to goof up and cut the wrong window. if you've done all your measurements correctly, you should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 windows then to cut out. Now, since this material is a little bit thicker, make sure you've got a fresh blade in your X-Acto knife. If you don't have a fresh blade, you're just going to make a mess of all this work that you've done. You're also going to need to free up these corners in a little bit different way than we've used the X-Acto knife so far. Let me swap my blade out and I'll show you how. As a little reminder, you never just throw a blade like this in the garbage. It's always a good idea to either tuck it into a piece of cardboard or wrap it up in a piece of paper. That way it doesn't stick anybody who happens to take the trash out later. Now, as we're cutting out these grids, you want to try to do as little work here as possible. With this thicker material, we're going to want to make sure that you actually cut all the way through this stock, so you may have to take 2 passes. With a nice fresh blade, I shouldn't have to do that. But as I'm cutting, because I want these corners to release, I'm actually going to have to do a slight overcut at each corner. If you've got all of them overcut, you should just have all of your windows pop right out, no problem. If you get any windows that are a little sticky, like these guys here, don't just rip them out. Come in and let's actually kind of cross-cut those corners just a little bit so that the last little bits of clinging paper pop right out. The crosscuts happen here at these corners. You want to make sure that you actually cut just a little bit beyond these corners. And when I say a little bit, I mean a fraction of an inch, a 32nd or so that there's a little tiny X at the corner where your blade cut just past the lines. That'll make sure that you get these nice clean window pop-outs. Now we're ready to use this in our sketchbooks. So we'll open up to the next blank page in your sketchbook and turn it sideways so that the binding is along the top. And what we'll do is we'll actually lay in a few of these grids horizontally across the page. We'll start with the first one. You can use your 6H pencil again here. Line it up square or square-ish to the edge of the page and lightly trace in your 5 square grid. Now, when you've got your first grids laid in, go ahead and butt this right up against the edges of your first grid and lay in a second column. And a third. We'll hang on to this grid because it's a piece that we'll end up using a whole bunch more. We'll probably end up filling this whole page, or pretty nearly. So what I'll end up doing is just stealing a piece of this blue tape off my cutting mat, and I'll tape it right down to the inside of this page. That way I don't lose it. Sticking it in the front pocket will work just fine too. Now we're actually ready to begin some of our value drawings. We're going to use these first 2 today, and for those I want you to find your ink pens. One of your ink pens is a Sharpie pen, and you pop off the tip. You'll see that the very tip of this thing is a felt tip, and the felt tip is really fragile. So in a moment we'll use a particular type of drawing, right, where you might be tempted to just kind of woodpecker in your designs. Be really careful because that felt tip will just collapse and it'll ruin the pen. The other pen that we've got here is a Rollerball pen and has a similarly very fine point on the end, but this one actually has a small ball on the end where the ink rolls out. Both one of these will lay down ink in a slightly different kind of way, but what I really like about working with pens like this is that it's a very committed drawing style. There is no erasing, in other words. You'll be able to sort of use these somewhat interchangeably. They're not exactly like a fine art tool. These are actually more along the lines of an office tool. The biggest difference between sort of the fine art versions of these pens and the office variety is in the ink itself, in the sort of color fastness or the archival quality of the ink. Otherwise, they behave very similarly to the pens that cost 3 or 4 times the amount. So we'll get used to our drawings with these before we bump up to something more higher quality. For our first drawing exercise, I'm going to use the Rollerball Pen because the ink flows very quickly. Before I actually come to my drawing here, I'm just going to use this pen, get it woken up a little bit, make sure that the ink is flowing, and also just sort of get a feel for how that ink is going to behave on the page. In a minute, we'll come right up to this design here and start laying in our first 5-step value gradation. For all of our gradations all across this page, I want you to think of this top row as the darkest square. To get dark out of a technique using these pens, we'll start with some crosshatching. In this first row, I'm going to start in the upper left-hand corner and lay a bunch of parallel lines down that are very tight and close together. Move quickly with this design and don't belabor these lines. This next row, I'm going to lay a similar set of parallel lines, but the spacing in between them is going to be a little bit wider. Again, a little bit wider, a little bit wider. Okay, now just by itself, those sort of lines already kind of give me the illusion that this is a darker value and then it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. Now these two values starting to feel a little bit similar to me. I'm going to come back through and lay some crossing lines across these ones to really exaggerate that difference. This time I'm going to try to match the distance, match the spacing on each one of these lines. Turn the sketchbook a little bit and I'll go bottom up the other direction. The overall feel of this design should be dark to light. If you blow it, don't worry. Move over one more time and try it again on this side. The more you practice with this technique, the better you get. I find that having a piece of scrap paper close by is not a bad way to sort of get that ink going, especially if this is a newer technique for you. Now this next row is going to be a little bit slower. It's going to be a little bit pickier. We're going to use the felt tip pen for this one. The reason I like the felt tip is because as the ink sort of rolls out of this pen very quickly, the ink bleeds out of this tip very slowly, and we'll start to kind of fill the paper with ink. I like the way the ink sort of moves in a gradual sort of seeping way from this pen, and it works very, very well for a technique that we'll call stippling, or individual dots or points of value that will build slowly over time. The closest thing to this technique that you probably have experienced will be something like the pixels on your screen, except imagine this now being you laying in every single pixel. If you are tempted to sort of speed up this process by kind of woodpeckering your way through, be careful. Remember, you're going to damage your felt tip. It's better to just lay that point down on its side and let the ink bleed. I'll work up a reasonably uniform kind of field of value here and then slowly work my way down. So now that I've got my basic kind of tones laid in, remember that this is a sort of a system of comparison. I'm not going for pure white on top, and I'm not going for pure black on the bottom. Thank goodness, right? That would take forever to get pure black up here just by point by point by point. But we're kind of getting a comparison. This should be darker than this one. This should be darker than this one. This should be darker than this one. We're sort of setting up a field of grays. So go ahead and lay in as uniform of a field of color as you can. There should be no light areas and no dark areas. There shouldn't be any patterns or lines kind of struck through this area. Work towards a sort of smooth field of tone, a smooth field of gray. So you notice that I'm sort of going from box to box. I'm not working up each individual box. I'm sort of building them all together. Where I hope you land somewhere at the end here is sort of an easily identifiable sort of 5-step gradation. The crosshatching, which is made just using straight lines, and the darkness or lightness is really determined by how much white space is left in between the lines. And the stippling or sort of pointless technique, where the value is made up in how much white is left on the page here and the spacing in between those dots. Go ahead and work up those two techniques, and guys, I will see you in the studio.